Perfect. So welcome to our session today where we're going to talk about something called contingent decisions. Now, the way I've decided to structure the session is through a series of questions, such as these questions here. So I want to just start very briefly with who is here and why we are here. The reason for that is because there potentially is quite a variety of different type of people and pension scheme on here. So it's just good to get that out at the beginning so we can then see how the session is going to run. So I'm going to run through the session by answering these questions that you can see on the screen. So who is here? Why are we here? What is a contingent decision? What is the remedy period? What is an opt-out? What is not an opt-out? What does this mean? What does it cost? Why would I do this? And other considerations and process. To be honest, the longest part of the session is likely to be the bit under other considerations. But before I get there, I want to make sure we're all in the same place, which is why we're going to do it in this order. So you might know some of the things that I'm going to tell you already, but it doesn't hurt to do a recap. You might notice as well that just to keep the session flowing really smoothly, I have cameras off and microphones are also off for this session. 100 people signed up, so if everybody does attend, it's quite tricky to keep all the microphones going, but you will have the option to ask questions in the chat box. I will pause as I go through, do ask questions, and I'll come back to them as well, and also there'll be time at the end of the session. So let's start with who might be here. Now, I haven't done a register, but I know some of the people who are here. So on this session, we have members of the public sector pension schemes, and they could be members of any public sector pension scheme. I haven't made this a scheme-specific session. I'm anticipating if there are any members here, most of them are going to be NHS, but it's a good chance we could have teachers or civil service here as well. And it's also fair to say that we might have representation across the nations. So England and Wales, we've definitely got people from England and Wales here, I can tell that already, but we may also have people from Scotland and Northern Ireland. The reason this is significant is because the actual process that we follow could be different for different schemes. I'm not going into the ins and outs of all of the processes for all of the schemes, but I'm going to signpost you. But that's one of the reasons why, because we could have people here from all over. We also have other people on here who are not necessarily members of the scheme. There are some financial advisors on here. Hello and welcome. There might be some employers on here, colleagues of people, support group, and also who I will refer to as emotional support humans. So that is basically where you might have somebody here who's attending with someone because it's complicated and sometimes two heads are better than one. And that is also absolutely fine. When I'm going to talk about contingent decisions, I'm going to talk about you as in the member. So I'm directing a lot of my conversation to the member. So that's just as well. So you know what I'm doing when I'm using tenses and in what person I'm referring to the member when I talk about you. Appreciate you yourselves might not actually be a member, but that's what I mean. Okay. Can see why I did this bit, can't you? So why are we here? So I am going to talk to you about something called a contingent decision. And I'm going to talk to you about the how and the what. Now, there are potentially many different aspects to what could be classified as a contingent decision, which you will see in a minute. But I'm going to focus on one particular aspect, which is called opting out. And we're also going to go into the detail of what that is. Okay. Now, a contingent decision is very specific to the McCloud ruling. It's not about anything else. So what a contingent decision is a decision that was made based on a set of circumstances that applied at the relevant time. Those circumstances have now changed. So can you revisit that decision? As far as pension schemes are concerned, normally no, you get what you get and what you agreed to at the time. However, because the McCloud changes are retrospective, so that means they're being applied to a past date, then you would have to question whether you would have made the same decision again. And that's what they're allowing you to do under the McCloud ruling. So essentially, a change was introduced for many on the 1st of April 2015. And on that basis, people were making decisions up to 2015 and also after 2015. Now, in 2019, this was declared unlawful. So what they meant was that the way in which the changes came in on the 1st of April 2015 was age discrimination. And we're not allowed to do that. Now, the reason for that was because not everybody was moved into the new section in April 2015. Some people were, some people were not, and some people did, but at a later date. And all of that centered around how long somebody had to go until their normal pension age. And the problem with that is it's an age discrimination issue, and you're not allowed to discriminate in that way. This is not unique to any just one particular public sector scheme. It's right across all of the schemes, because all of the schemes introduced those new career average sections in 2015. So there were a couple of legal challenges that were going on around the same time. The one that we know and love is the McCloud judgment, or the McCloud Remedy. And that was the initial case that went through the Court of Appeal in 2019. And that was raised by Judge McCloud, who was a member of the Judicial Pension Scheme. And I laugh because I think if anyone's going to know, she is, isn't she? So at that point in 2019, once we had that ruling, the Treasury Department in central government have had to come up with a remedy that removes the age discrimination aspect. And those regulations were finalised in 2023, and they outlined essentially a retrospective fix. So what that means is they've got to go back to what happened in 2015 and change it. So we had people, even from 2012, when we knew about the changes in 2015, make decisions right the way up until the regulations formally changed in 2023. And so the question then becomes, would they make the same decision as they did then, knowing what they know now? And that's really what we're looking at with a contingent decision. Now, a contingent decision has lines that it can't cross. So, for example, somebody may say, oh, well, I wouldn't have taken my pension in 2019 if I knew that I could have carried on in my old scheme till 2022. I don't think they're going to revisit that, because you did take the pension, you've had the pension, and you also had to make employment decisions at the time. So even though the contingent decision is a concept, it's likely it's not going to be applied across every single decision that somebody made in that period. Having said that, we don't have the guidance for all of the contingent decision types yet. So the ones that we're really focusing on, as I mentioned earlier, is opting out. So just be aware of that. There could be more changes to come. But I suspect a lot of the other contingent decisions will have to be a case of providing evidence and will be reviewed on an individual basis. And therefore, it's going to take a very long time for all such cases to be reviewed. Okay, but the principle is we made a decision based on the fact that the 2015 scheme was in 2015. It actually wasn't, because it was delayed then until 2022. So what are we doing here? That's essentially what the whole contingent decision concept is about. So what is the remedy period? The remedy period is the period which relates to the McCloud Remedy. So basically it's the period over period that we're assessing to look at the decisions that people made. So for example, if Paul retired in 2011 on a certain basis, he can't revisit that because that's outside of the period. We've got a very specific amount of time, and that is the 1st of April to the 31st of March 2022. Because what they did as part of the remedy was they allowed everybody to continue in their original scheme up to the 31st of March 2022. And that was also called rollback. And you'll have seen that more on recent statements. So we're really looking, and then from the 1st of April 22, everybody has joined the 2015 or the career average section by default. Doesn't matter how old they are, doesn't matter anything else. They've all now joined from the 1st of April 2022. So that period is not under question, because that's had the correct application. Nothing is age related. There's no discrimination. So from the 1st of April 22, we're all in the new section. Up to the 31st of March 2015, we're all definitely in the old section. And then the bit that comes under McCloud is 2015 to 2022. Okay. Now, the way that the remedy is working is that actually for the period from 2015 to 2022, you will be given a choice as to how you want the benefits to be calculated. And that could be what we call option A, or standard, which is benefits up to March 22 on the old scheme. Or it can be what we call option B, or alternative, which is up to March 15 on the old scheme, and then the new scheme starts earlier in April 15. Okay, so if you look at your annual statements, you should be able to see those different options now. And what you'll find is that the amounts in each pension scheme will differ depending on which option that you're looking at, because it's all about the period between 2015 and 2022. Now, goes without saying, there is a significant amount of work that the scheme are having to undertake to implement a remedy, deal with people who've already retired, deal with deaths that have already happened, transfers out, pension sharing on divorce, all of those different issues. And all of the public sector schemes are in different places with implementing their remedy, but none of them have finished it, and it's not a quick fix. I know it's frustrating, but it's definitely not a quick fix. But one of the things that they are all now looking at is this thing called contingent decisions. So the default position for everyone is what we call the rollback, which is option A or standard, and that is your old scheme up until March 22. And that's why we've got to revisit some of the decisions that people have made. Because again, if we came out in 2019 because we thought we were going to have to join the 2015 section, but actually we now found out we could have carried on in 95 until 2022, would you have made the same decision? And that's really what it's looking at. So this is this whole piece that we're now having to do to look at whether people are affected by this and what they need to do about it. So we're calling this opt-outs. Most of the pension scheme are calling it opt-outs, but they might also be calling it a contingent decision and then have a subheading of opt-out. So when you look on your pension scheme website, start with contingent decision, see if you can find what you need, or go to opt-outs. I have put some helpful links to each of the pension scheme sites at the back of the slides. So let's start with what is an opt-out, because anybody who doesn't know, we run a Facebook group to help public sector pension scheme members, and we currently have almost 55,000 members of that group. And one of the questions that I get a lot is this an opt-out? Is that an opt-out? And so I think let's just clarify what we mean by an opt-out. So an opt-out is somebody who elected voluntarily to come out of the pension scheme, but will continue with their employer. So for example, if I work in the NHS and I chose to come out of the pension scheme but carried on in my NHS role, I just didn't want to be in the scheme anymore, that's an opt-out. And not only that, you had to have opted out between the 1st of April 2015 and the 31st of March 2022. It doesn't matter if it was full that whole period, or if you didn't opt out until 2017, or you opted out in 2019, it's anything within that 7-year period, okay? So if you opted out at any point in that 7 years, then that is what we would classify as an opt-out for these purposes. It also doesn't matter why you opted out. So this is where we're quite lucky. The regulations are saying it's a contingent decision linked to McCloud, but you do not have to evidence why you opted out. The reason doesn't matter. So you don't have to say, oh, I opted out because I didn't want to be in the new scheme. There's none of that. The threshold is very low. The threshold is just, did you choose to come out of the scheme at any point in this period? So you might have chosen to come out because of tax, such as annual or lifetime allowance. Those tax rules themselves have now changed. So this is very fortuitous. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it was lack of understanding, bad advice, cost, whatever it was. It just matters, did you elect to voluntarily come out of the scheme at any point in that period? That is an opt-out. Okay. Okay, does anybody have got any questions on that? What an opt-out is not, let's just cover that first before we pause. It's not somebody who's left the pension scheme because they've changed their job. That's not opting out, that's leaving, that's different. So for example, if I was working in the NHS and then I left to go and work for Tesco, for example, then I have left employment. I have come out of the scheme, that is true, but it's not that I voluntarily exited the scheme. I've literally left employment. That is not an opt-out. You cannot retrospectively apply for service within that period. Somebody who came out of the scheme because the pension was put into payment, that is not an opt-out. Okay, you've put the pension into payment, you've triggered something. So you haven't necessarily opted out in that way. If you're on a career break, that might not apply. As you see, I have put maybe, because there's always a maybe. You know, whenever we do anything to do with pensions, there's always a yes, but. When you come out of the pension on a career break, normally you can choose to pay for some of the career break, but you can't choose to pay for all of it. Depends on the choice that you made at the time. There's potential, depending on the career break and how it was implemented, that could be revisited, but it might be quite specific. So we would have to look at the circumstances around that. Okay. So it's not somebody who left due to an employment change, and it's not somebody who's put the pension into payment. The reason I've put that one on there is because before 2023, if you did a retire and return and you took the pension, you were not allowed to rejoin the scheme. So that doesn't count. That's not one of those. Okay. Hi, Andrew. So what if you opted out and opted back in within the remedy period? So we see that quite a lot, actually. So I'll just jump back. For tax reasons, people might have come in and out a bit over the period. That's okay. We can still look at the periods that you would opted out for over the period. So, for example, if you opted out in 2017-18, then opted back in 2019, and then opted out again, we can still look at the periods that you opted out for, so long as it's within that 7 years. Okay, so you can still consider that as part of the overall review. You are welcome. Hello, Alison. Once you've taken partial retirement, you don't get an annual statement or forecast. That's correct. And I'll come back to that, Alison, because it's not something that we're going to cover as part of this session. This session is very specifically about the contingent decision option, okay, and what it means so that people know what they need to do. So what does this mean? Oh, question. Hello, Louise. If I haven't opted out, should I try and stay on here? Is it not relevant for me? So this session is all about the contingent decision for opt-outs. It's not a general session. So if you're here for anything else, it might not be the right session for you. We do run overview sessions that are more suitable for other circumstances. So what this means then is that if you opted out of the scheme at any point between April 15 and March 22, you can reverse that decision. This can be for some or all of the period. So let's just say I opted out for the whole of the 7 years. I don't have to put myself back in for the whole 7 years. I can pick and choose. I could choose 1 year, I could choose 2 years, I could choose 2 consecutive years, I could choose separate years, I could choose 6 months from each year. So it's quite nuanced as to what you can choose. And what I'm going to show you later might influence on how you choose to do that. But this is an opportunity to increase your pension benefits beyond what they are currently. So it's definitely worth looking at. Now, you might look at it, as we'll come on to shortly, and it might not be beneficial for you, and that's okay. But unless you look at it, you don't know. So there are some interesting things here to factor in as well. If you are somebody who opted out because of annual allowance charges, now the annual allowance is the tax-free limit on the amount your pension can grow by in a tax year. And it doesn't affect the vast majority of people, but it can affect, particularly in the NHS, clinicians and high earning teaching staff and civil servants. Now, if you choose to go back into the scheme, then no annual allowance charge would be generated for 2015-16 up to and including 18-19. And the reason for that is because HMRC have a scope of which they are allowed to work to, and they can't do anything that falls outside of that scope, whether it is not the fault of the member or the individual. This is not your fault. You did not create the McCloud Remedy. So we could put you back in for those periods and you would not have to pay an annual allowance charge, even if you would have done under normal circumstances. So that can change the position. Similarly, if you are in the NHS England and Wales and you are a clinical worker, then there is compensation available for any annual allowance charges for 2019-20, which basically breaks down to you don't really have to pay those either. So that also changes the field of play. Now, again, if you were one of those higher earning people who had concerns about tax, one of the things that applied until 2023 was the lifetime allowance. and the lifetime allowance was the limit on the amount our pension benefits could be worth before we paid any pensions tax at retirement. So combined with the annual allowance, this was quite tricky for some people. So they opted to come out of the scheme. However, the lifetime allowance was removed in 2023. So remember what I said before, it doesn't matter why you opted out, you now have the option to consider going back in, and that might be quite interesting. You may have had a waxing pay increase since you opted out. And if you come back into the scheme, it will link back to the current pay where it's higher. I'm going to come back to that in a second. So it will elevate all of the pension benefits potentially. As I mentioned before, you can choose the period. You don't have to choose all of the periods you were opted out for. You don't have to choose consecutive years. You can just be very strategic about how you do that by looking at which is going to give you the best option for the least amount of cost. So rarely do you get an opportunity to revisit some of this decision making, particularly, as I said, they're not asking you for the reason why. They just want to know, did you opt out in that period? So it is creating some quite interesting conversations for people to understand potentially what is the art of the possible. Hello, Jenny. What if you opted out in 2021, left the NHS for 22 months and returned to NHS still opted out? So you, in theory, could perhaps look to reinstate the service from when you opted out up to 31st of March 22, if that's when if you were still in the scheme then. Because remember, period is only for up to the remedy period, which is the 31st of March 22. So you could potentially reinstate that little bit, absolutely. Now, to reinstate the service, it's not free, obviously, because we would all be doing it, wouldn't it? You've got to remember that for being a member of the NHS pension scheme, you are required to pay contributions. And normally these contributions are deducted from your pay. You should see that on your payslip, and you get tax relief on those contributions. Whilst you were out of the scheme, you did not pay those contributions. So if you want to come back in, you will have to pay them for the period affected. You do still get tax relief on them, but you will also have to pay a bit of interest. So what you have to do is look at what those contributions are. You may, depending on the circumstances, have additional annual allowance charges that you will also need to consider. And some employers, if you opted out of the pension scheme due to annual and/or lifetime allowance reasons, the employer would give you extra pay in lieu of the employer contributions or in lieu of some of the employer contributions. In theory, if you've had those contributions, you need to pay them back to the employer, but that is an agreement between you and the employer, not the pension scheme. So we need to look at this, don't we? We need to try and understand the benefit versus the cost. And that's really what we're going to be trying to do. You will be able to get a quote from your scheme of any member contributions you may be required to pay back, but I have yet to see a scheme that works out your annual allowance position for you, because obviously they don't know all of your details, and you will need to liaise with your employer if you received extra contributions in lieu of pay. That particularly applies to the NHS. So there is a bit of analysis that needs to be done there as to whether it is worth it. Sarah, what if you were in the pension 2013, left 2019 for a few months, then joined again the following year? So long as you left, Sarah, because you opted out, then that is a potential for you to opt back in. If you left because you went to work somewhere else, then again, that doesn't come under the category of an opt-out. So it just depends on the circumstances. If you just chose to come out of the scheme, for example. So I wrote this header of why would I do this, and then I didn't write any slides because I would have thought it was perfect, like quite self-explanatory. The reason you would do it is because it's giving you the opportunity to revisit those decisions, and it's giving you the opportunity to potentially increase your pension benefits in a way that you wouldn't normally have. Equally, it's not always beneficial. Okay, so the financial advisors on the session now are making that sucking noise through their teeth because it isn't. But you don't know unless you have the analysis done. okay? Because we need to look at different things. And I'm going to show you some of those considerations now. And I'm going to apologise because this is where it does get a bit technical. I'm expecting questions to come at this point as well. Technical. Okay, inflation. So when somebody comes out of the scheme, depending on the scheme, depends on the period of time, the deferred benefits, as they will then be. So when you leave a scheme, the pension benefits are calculated at the date that you leave, and they're called deferred. And those benefits increase each year by inflation. Okay. Now, depending on the time out of the scheme, you can keep the inflation link on the benefits before the break. So what does that mean? So what that means is that if you come out of the scheme, in the case of the NHS, it's a 12-month break. So if you came out of the scheme in 2017 and you were out for at least 12 months, then the benefits up to 2017 are revalued by inflation. And then if you come back in after 12 months, the scheme will use the higher of pay before break plus inflation or current pay. This is really important because we had some massive inflation in 2023 and 2024. In 2023, it was 10.1%, and in 2024, it was 6.7%. Very unusual circumstances to find someone whose pay has increased by that much in that 2-year period. Okay, so when I was doing some analysis the other day, somebody wanted me to look at reinstating them for the whole period. So it was a case where they'd come out in 2017. And when I did the analysis, the pension was £21,000 when they left in 2017, but we revalue it. And when we revalued it, it was 29,000 as at now. If I put them back in the scheme for the whole period, the pension was 30,000. So 30,000 compared to 29,000, and then it would cost them about £18,000 to put them back in. It doesn't work. The maths doesn't work because you're paying £18,000 to have pension almost exactly the same. But what does work is keeping a 12-month break and then coming back in, because then the bit before the break still gets to use that higher rate of pay plus inflation. So it's still your 29,000. And then anything going forwards is calculated on the new pay. And then that gave us a pension of 35,000, which looks very different. So it's very nuanced, the breaks. Now, NHS I've used there as an example has 12 months. Some of the other schemes have different lengths of time. But determining which period you come back for, depending on the size of your break, can be quite crucial in looking at whether it's worth coming back in for the whole period or not. And I would say in most cases, probably not coming back in for the entire period, but it does depend on circumstances. So I'm going to stop there and see if any of the technical people or anybody else has any questions on that. Does that make sense? Normally we don't see inflation that high and it wouldn't necessarily be that different. But what we've found is there's lots where it is, and that's what you've kind of got to think is which bits are we looking at and why. And members themselves, hello members, won't necessarily know that. You need an expert to help you determine that so that you get the biggest bang for your buck. There's no point in paying, for example, 5 years worth of contributions to get virtually the same pension. But it might be worth paying 1 or 2 years worth of contributions to get more pension. But you need to know that, and you need to know what that looks like. So there's quite a bit of modelling that goes on there. The pension scheme as well. So all of the pension schemes, you have to go through a process. You have to go to your pension scheme and go, hello, please, will you give me a quote for reinstating this bit of service? And they will. But what they won't do is give you the revalued figures. They'll give you the deferred figures, and then they won't add on the inflation. So you won't be comparing the same things. So it's what you are able to do is get help for that and claim the feedback, because they haven't given you all of the information that you need to make that decision, and it's really critical. So inflation is super important when we're looking at the years and what may or may not be possible, or what may or may not give the better result. The other thing then is the annual allowance and the lifetime allowance. So remember, if you're reinstating service, then we have to recalculate all of your annual allowance history. Now, as I said before, anything between 15, 16 up to and including 18, 19 doesn't change anything, because we're not going to have to amend any tax charges in that position. It may amend carry forward though, but if you've got any tax charges in any of those years, then it won't change that. But if you paid into something else in that time, we've got to revisit that. We may now have a tax charge because you paid X amount into a self-invested pension plan, for example. So we need to make sure that we deal with all of those things. The schemes are not going to be able to do that. The pension scheme is not going to give you figures take into account changes in your pensions tax position. It might also change your current pensions tax position, because you might, if you come back into the scheme, you might not have the unused allowance that you had from earlier years. So it knocks it forward, and it can affect future as well. The scheme isn't going to give you that. So again, we've got to think about those things. The scheme will go, oh, your pension will increase by £4,000 a year, but it's not telling you evaluation, and it's not telling you about any annual allowance implications, because it relies on you to work that out. So they are a consideration. Also, if you started receiving your pension before the lifetime allowance was removed, then we're going to have to recalculate the lifetime allowance charge as well. So there's all, and again, the scheme won't do that. So there's kind of all these things we've got to kind of factor in. Oh, I can do that now. We're on annual allowance. I don't know who. Compensation. Let me jump back. So we've got a question. Why is there possible compensation for the AA charge in 1920? So let's go back. Here we go. So 1920, it was the dark days. I don't know if you remember, it was the start of COVID. It was awful. The annual allowance looked a bit different back in 1920, and the allowance itself was £40,000. But if anybody earned over £110,000 in taxable income, then the annual allowance actually tapered right down to a really low amount. Now, in the NHS in particular, it's not that difficult for a clinician or consultant to get over £110,000 on taxable income. So what was happening was that the government at the time had waiting list initiatives. I know we've still got them, they're not new, but we had a lot of waiting list initiatives. We had the start of COVID. There was a requirement for people to work extra to support the NHS. People didn't want to work extra because it was suddenly going to massively impact on their pensions tax. Waiting list initiative work and things like that is not pensionable, so it doesn't increase the pension, but what it was doing was increasing the taxable pay. So by increasing the taxable pay, the allowance was coming down. So if people were just losing, then they weren't gaining anything from that, which is not really the principle of it. So the government had to make a decision, because people were like, no, don't want to do that, thank you. So what NHS England did was that they said, for any clinical workers, frontline clinical workers who have an annual allowance charge for 1920, they would compensate you for that. So there are rules around it. So you have to have used the scheme pays option to pay the tax. And then when your pension comes into payment, the amount that gets taken off in scheme pays, NHS England effectively reimburse back to you. And that they just did it for that year, because the following year in 21-22, the annual allowance tax rules and thresholds were uplifted, so less people were then affected. So it was a temporary fix just to try and carry through what was needed of the NHS until they could formalise changes in 21-22. So that's why the compensation exists, but it doesn't exist for everybody in the NHS. It was very specifically frontline clinical workers in England and Wales, nowhere else. But that's why it's there. You are most welcome. Right, where are we? Something else that is difficult and would have to be looked on a case-by-case basis is if your pension is already in payment. So the pension scheme, again, is not likely to tell you this up front, but you might actually have restricted options here. So the first thing is abatement. So this doesn't usually affect NHS. It did pre-COVID, but probably doesn't really affect many people on the session, if at all. But the other schemes have abatement. So abatement is a rule that says you can't, through, for example, civil service pension and civil service pay, when added together, you can't earn more than what you were earning prior to retirement. And if you do, the pension is reduced or abated, so your income doesn't exceed that level. So if we are going to reinstate opted out service retrospectively, what we're going to be doing is increasing the pension, which then might mean that we are now abated retrospectively for those years. So what we're saying is, let's just say Sally put herself in a position where her pay when she retired was £50,000 a year, and her pension was £30,000 a year, and she carried on working on 20,000. So 30,000 plus 20,000 is 50,000. That was what she was earning pre-retirement, no abatement issues. Okay. Then they're going to she's going to opt back in retrospectively. So her pension is now not £30,000 a year, it's £37,000 a year. Well, when we add 37,000 to her pay of 20,000, that gives us, by my maths, £57,000, which is too high, which means the pension has to be abated. So we have to be really careful of the abatement position, because it was abated then and it would be abated now. So we need to make sure that people understand, if they're impacted by that, what they need to do. Now, as I said, it's not usually NHS. But teachers and civil service can be really hit by that quite heavily. So that's a real big consideration as well, because we might not be getting the benefit unless we suddenly leave our job. Then that might be worth it, but we're not necessarily going to get the back pay that's due from it. So does it carry the same incentive as it did before? Probably not. What does affect the NHS though is contractual changes. So, and I'm arguing with NHS pensions about this quite a lot at the moment, and I feel like it's going to rumble on. So at the moment, if you are in the NHS and you've been out of the scheme for 5 years or more, you can take the pension and carry on working without having to implement a retire and return as it was, or a partial retirement as it now is, because you've had a 5-year break. Okay, perfect. So let's say we've got Roger, and Roger had 6 years out of the scheme because he opted out and put his pension into payment, and he didn't need to do any contractual or employment changes because that wasn't required at the time. Roger's now looking at reinstating some of his opted out service. The problem is if he reinstates any of it, his break is now going to be less than 5 years. And in that circumstance, he hasn't met the requirements of having a break in service to do a retire and return, because you've got to have a minimum of 24-hour break before taking the pension. Well, Roger didn't do that because he didn't need to do that at the time. And so it wouldn't have been allowed anyway. It would have been an entirely pointless process. But now he can't do an opt back in potentially because he hasn't had the break in service. Do you see the issue we are having here? We are going round in a loop with NHS pensions on this at the moment. So if you've got anybody whose pension is already in payment because they had a break of 5 years or more and they didn't do any contractual change, we need to look at that really carefully. And I suspect we'll need to raise it on a case-by-case basis, because what NHS pensions are saying is right, that is in the scheme rules, but I think it directly goes against the intent of the opportunity to do the opt back in. So there is an extra complication there that we're trying to work through. That is quite tricky. Not getting very far at the moment, to be honest. So again, if that's you, let's have a conversation, because I think we need to look at that. They have said they'll look at it on a case-by-case basis, but that again could take quite some time. Any questions there? No, all gone to sleep or stunned into silence, can't tell. Just an extra thing, because why not? When you opted out, you may, yes, Andrew, I know. When you opted out, you may have been paying added years. So added years was where you paid additional contributions to increase the service in your older pensions. That would have been 95 in NHS, classic in civil service, final salary 80ths in teachers, and so on. Obviously, when you opted out, that stopped. So you can opt back in and not reinstate your added years, or you can choose to reinstate your added years as well. They're separate things. So also, you might be somebody who just stopped the added years but carried on in the scheme. You can look to reinstate the added years retrospectively as well. So again, it had to have been during the remedy period, so between that 2015 and 2022 date. So again, just have a look at that. What I will say is I've seen one quote from NHS Pensions on this, and they got it totally wrong. So we'd readed it and went back, the member went back, and they sort of didn't really want to admit they'd done it wrong, and then they went, oh, here are your updated figures. Didn't apologise, but just be aware that the figures coming through from the scheme on the added years are overstating massively. So we just need to watch those as well if you get any quotes on those. And again, they won't be looking at annual allowance issues or anything like that. Again, if somebody retrospectively reinstates the added years, they'll have to pay back the contributions and so on. And I'm going to come on to that in a second. Yeah, so what they were doing, Joe, I'll give you an example. When you do added years, you commit to buy a certain amount of years over a period of time. So let's keep it simple. I'm going to buy 10 years over a 20-year period. That means that each year I'm adding half a year to my service. And that's what happens. So each year you see the added years is adding half a year to the service while we're doing it. So let's say I stopped paying added years after 10 years. That means I will have bought half of the service in this example, which would be 5 years. Perfect. So if I now want to look to reinstate it, what I'm looking at doing is picking up where I left off. So I'm going to carry on. So add on another 5 years, or in total, I'll have 10 years. That's the purpose of it. What NHS Pensions did was that they said, oh, well, if you carry on reinstating your added years, it will give you this much pension. But the amount of pension they quoted included the added years they've already bought. So they were double counting what they already had. So for this member, it looked like doing their added years reinstatement was going to give them an extra £5,000 worth of pension and £15,000 worth of lump sum. But we had to say, no, because you've already got half of that. So it's actually only going to give you £2,500 worth of pension and £7,500 worth of lump sum. So they were overstating the benefit that they would get to help, because obviously what they've got to do is say to the member, well, if you pay this much, you'll get this much extra. But they were overstating how much extra they would get. So when we redid that with our person, they said they didn't want to do it anymore because it wasn't giving them the benefit they thought it was. So we do have to be a bit careful because they haven't done that very well. I haven't seen any from the other schemes yet, so I can't comment on those, but just be aware if that's one of the things you're looking at, they may be overstating the benefit, not the cost. Okay, so how can we pay the contributions? And this might be where you need financial advice. So all of the financial advisors can sit up here. This is very nice. You've got options potentially, depending on your circumstances, how to pay the contributions. Because to be honest, if you're trying to pay back quite a few years worth of contributions, it's quite a lot of money. And we haven't all necessarily got that stuffed under a mattress. So there are different options. Their preference is that you just pay it, obviously. But you can do it in instalments, and you will have interest applied to that at the rate of NS&I. If your pension is in payment already, you can potentially do it through, rather than instalments that you pay, they will do instalments that they deduct from the pension before tax, which is interesting. But again, they will apply interest at NS&I. Now, the options that are available specifically can vary a bit from scheme to scheme, depending on your circumstances. So in the case that we were looking at last week, we have somebody who has to pay, they're a very high earner, £34,000. They have that money, they could pay it, but that money is currently getting them an investment return. So do they want to pay it? How does that compare to the instalments? You can do instalments over a 10-year period, regardless of how old you are, which is interesting. So how does that compare to the interest on the instalments, or how does it compare to the deductions on the pension? That's where the financial advice piece comes in, because they're looking then at investment returns on that money. So that might be something that you may need additional support with, depending on what your situation is and the cost and so on. But you can get quotes from the scheme as well on what the instalments would look like. And in fact, NHS Pensions England and Wales have the calculator. So if you put in the amount and say I want to pay over 10 years, it'll kind of give you an idea of what that looks like, which is quite all right. And that does seem to work okay, from what I can tell. So how do you know what to do? Yes, quite. It's tricky. It's a really complicated situation. It's very nuanced for individual circumstances. So we have seen people where it's very obvious what they should do because the benefit that they get far outweighs the cost. We have seen other people where it's been very much borderline, and we've seen other people where it's a bit like, oh no, maybe not. And that has surprised us because it's very depends on which scheme you're in, it depends on what periods of service, it depends on income, it depends on all of those things. What you must do, though, regardless of anything, even if you've got no idea what you want to do, if you are an opt and out in the period that we're talking about, go on your scheme website, links are going to be at the back, and get a quote. That's your starting point. Now, that quote may not tell you everything, as we've discussed. It may not be entirely accurate, but get your quote and then find yourself an expert who can look at the other stuff. So any nuances, what about the revaluation? What about annual allowance charges? What does this mean? And then your expert can do you some calculations and comparisons that says, okay, the pension scheme have given you this bit, which is quite high level. This is the detail that you need to look at. And that makes it much clearer for you to then determine what your outcome is. In most cases, you can claim the feedback from an expert. So the regulations allow for members to claim fees back up to a reasonable level, where the scheme was unable to provide them with all of the information and the situation is classed as complex. This is definitely complex because, as we've talked about, there's so many different things. We don't make the decision about whether you get the fee or not. We can help you do your application to reclaim the fee. NHS pensions is very clear. All of Scotland, Northern Ireland, England and Wales have said, yes, contingent decision, you can claim it back because it's really difficult. The other schemes have said where it's complex, this is complex, you can claim it back. But they ultimately will make the decision about that. Now, positive note, NHS pensions will pay your cost claim back within 3 to 4 weeks with 8% interest. They are doing that really quick. Nothing else is happening really quick in NHS pensions, but that bit is. So you are able to do that. Now, something else as well. If you're somebody who has annual allowance charges and you decide to proceed with your buyback of service, you will need a new RPSS, a new remedial pension savings statement. That will also need to be dealt with. Again, if you have to pay an expert to do that for you, you can claim that fee back again as well. Even though you might have already done it once, it's not your fault, so you're able to do it again. So there are a few things to do. Now, in terms of timelines, once you get your quote from the scheme, you will have 12 months to make your decision. So it should be quite long enough for you to see an expert, review it, analyse it, mull it over, get further advice if you need it, and then make your decision. This is not going to run forever. The regulations on McCloud say that everything should be done, try not to laugh, by 2030, 31. So if this is you, or if this is a colleague, or if you know people, because lots of people did opt out for pensions tax, go and shout about it, because the sooner you get your quotes, the sooner we can move on this before they do decide to close a door specifically. So this is really important because it could really benefit you. Again, it might not, but then you know. And that's the thing. It's never having the what if, isn't it? It's knowing what the options are and what you can do. But as you can see, it can be quite tricky and there's quite a few things to work through. And it's not always as clear as you think it is going to be. So we definitely do need to weigh that through. Yes, the scheme will have to provide the revised RPSS. However, what I would say is ask for one. So once it's gone in, once you've made your decision and said, right, I'm going to buy back this bit of service, whatever bit of service it is, here you are, please give me a revised RPSS. And I would make sure you ask for it. They obviously can't actually do that until they've reinstated the service, because once they reinstate the service, they can then run the calculations. So again, it's not necessarily going to be quick, but they should absolutely provide the revised RPSS because the position has changed. And, we did about 500 or 600 RPSS, so I can't wait to do them all again. We do know, I don't have any stats for the other schemes. They're going to be lower. They are going to be a lot lower. NHS England and Wales is the biggest public sector scheme by some margin. So total membership across actives, deferreds and pensioners exceeds 5 million. So it is huge. It's the biggest employer in Europe. So for scale, it's massive. And also we had lots of issues with opting out because of the tax issues that we've talked about for clinicians and consultants particularly. But we do know there are over 200,000 people in the NHS who could be eligible for a contingent decision due to opting out. So it's quite a big number. Now, the other schemes, as I say, will be much smaller. Doesn't mean they don't exist. So we're expecting a lot of this is going to come from the NHS. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of time, it's potentially a lot of money, but obviously it is what is owed to members. The other thing is that the scheme is not going to tell you proactively you can do this on an individual basis. They're not going to say, hello, Andrew, did you know you can do this because you opted out? As far as they're concerned, information is on the website. You need to know. It's one of the reasons we're doing this webinar and we're going to put it online is because people need to find out themselves and then they need to walk through the steps that they need to follow. So if you do know people, shout about it, link them to the webinar, whatever it is, just so that they can check if this applies to them and is it something that they want to look at. But it's quite significant and it's going to be a busy time. And then we'll have to do all the RPSS again as well, which is marvellous. Hello, Anne. Civil service opted out into partnership. Will scheme contributions for partnership need to be paid back together with what has already been put into payment? Excellent question, Anne. So for anyone who doesn't know, the Civil Service Pension Scheme has a defined contribution option as an alternative called partnership. So some people decided they didn't want to be in Alpha, which is their 2015 scheme, so went across and opted into partnership instead. And the short answer, Anne, is yes, that will all need to be unpicked. So with you guys, it's actually quite tricky because what we need to do is a piece of analysis that says, okay, well, if we left it in partnership, making some assumptions, what would that look like? Versus if it went into Alpha, what would that look like? But yeah, effectively the schemes are going to have to unpick that, which is quite messy. It also, I suspect, is way down the list because of the transition from My CSP to Capita. It's no secret that that has been nothing short of a disaster. And so they are, I think, putting certain contingent decisions on the back burner until later this year. But yeah, the theory stands they'll have to unpick all of that DC investment and re-push it into Alpha to get the Alpha benefit. Absolutely. And people in that situation, you definitely might want to look at getting regulated financial advice because you've got a defined contribution element with investment returns. And for anybody who doesn't know, the employer contribution into partnership is quite high. So that is a real big piece of analysis that might need some financial advice input as well. Alison, I've never left and continued in full-time employment and was told to change schemes. And I have two options. Does this situation apply to me? No, Alison. So everybody's in two schemes now because of that ruling that we mentioned earlier. If you didn't opt out, this is not for you. All of the session that we've been talking about here is about people who opted out and now have the option to retrospectively opt back in. We do have a separate webinar about McCloud, which talks about the two options that you might find helpful, which is on the YouTube channel. Jacqueline, hello. I've had to change devices due to internet things, so may have missed a few minutes. Oh, don't. I was going to ask if this is a possible contingent decision. Let's go. Had MHO status, so my plan was to pay extra in when I was back full time due to doubling up years. And I was moving into 2015 due to my age when I just started doubling up. So when I was annoyed about, is this no longer having to MHO? Does this count? So because of the rollback, because you've been rolled back into 1995 until March 22 anyway, all of those years would have automatically doubled up regardless. If you have paid in extra already because you missed out on the doubling, then you can revisit that decision. And that's a separate type of contingent decision under additional pension. But it might be an idea to email me and I'll have a chat with you about that if that's helpful. In view of this, will the scheme offer compensation rather than reinstatement? I don't think so, Anne. I think the contingent decision is about reversing the decision as opposed to compensation. But if you can make a case for compensation and you can evidence it, it's possible, but I'm not sure that they're going to do that, if I'm honest with you. Hello, apologies if this has been covered. I joined slightly late. Do you have any views on NHS's voluntary redundancy scheme and whether the McCloud Remedy could influence the timing of when people choose to leave and in turn what might affect redundancy calculations? So, slightly different, but I'll cover it because we've been having some conversation about this. The problem that people are having who are going on redundancy at the moment is that the scheme, the pension scheme, is unable to provide the pension figures needed for people to make decisions about something called capitalised costs. And the reason for that is because the scheme had intended to apply both McCloud options, so you could see the different costs under the different options. They are not able to do that. So what the scheme have said is that for anybody who went prior to that change, you would have gone under one option and you'll get to explore the other and the different costs retrospectively. For anybody else, you need to talk to your employer because they're supposed to be extending the deadlines where you can't get the right information, ideally. Otherwise, they're in breach of their own terms. So that's, again, it's a different question, but you do need to probably go and speak to your employer about that because it's more of an employment thing. Although it's the pension scheme, it's what your employer is choosing to do. Perfect. Okay, so let me jump back to where I was. Now, it may not surprise you to learn at this point that we can help you with contingent decisions. We've been working on quite a few of these already. We are continuing to work on them at the moment. So in the links that you're going to get at the back of the slides, the first one is going to take you to our webpage, which talks about how we can help you and what you need to do. It also tells you the costs and the information that we need. We need quite a bit of information about individuals because we're effectively having to rebuild a pension record for them to be able to run the calculations. So what I would suggest is the process should be go and get the quote from the scheme. And while you're waiting for that, get the information together that's on the rest of the list. And then we can start looking at the different options that are available. You don't have to use us. Of course, you can use other people out there. Can I just make sure that whoever you do use, they are an expert in NHS pensions because it's really important that they kind of have that real nuanced understanding of the scheme. Our fee for a contingent decision piece of work, which is doing all of the calculations, reports, meetings to discuss, probably a lot of liaison afterwards because it goes on, help filling in the form, is £12.50 plus VAT, which is £1,500. But remember, you can claim that fee back. I've also linked the Civil Service Pension Scheme. This tells you about contingent decisions for them, contingent decisions for the NHS pension scheme in England and Wales, and also how you get your quote, contingent decisions for NHS Scotland, and also contingent decisions for teachers as well. So you've got the links to all the different areas there and the sites, so you can go on and have a look yourselves. I would stress, though, that because you're more than likely to be able to claim the feedback, big financial decisions, potentially big costs, do look at getting the help. It's really, really important. And it's important to understand things like the inflation and the tax implications as well. Okay. So there we are, an hour. Does anybody have any other questions about contingent decisions and opt-outs that we haven't covered? This is me, by the way. This is my email address. So I will email you the slides. So you'll have my email address anyway. But if you do think of any follow-up questions, then you can let me know. They are complicated and extensive is probably the language that I would use. It can be quite tricky. Also, just to note as well, if you had somebody who opted out before 2015, but was still opted out in the opt-out period, they can still reinstate the bit in the opt-out period. They just wouldn't necessarily be able to reinstate the bit before that. For example, if somebody opts out in 2012, they could potentially still reinstate some or all of the opt-out period. Perfect. Any questions? Right, that's brilliant. Hopefully that's been helpful. It's given you a little bit of an insight, certainly some food for thought anyway. If it does affect you or any of your clients, hello financial advisors, then definitely get the quotes because that's the bit that you need to start with, and then we can work backwards from there. One of the reasons the quotes is important is because one of the rules of the cost claim back scheme is, and it must be information the scheme didn't provide. So if you don't ask for the quote, they could say, well, we would have given you that. They wouldn't have done, but get the quote first, and then we all know what we're working to as well. So that's really good. You are all very welcome. The sun's come out here, so I hope it has where you are. Yeah, definitely drop me an email. I'm not in tomorrow. If you drop me an email, but I'll pick it up on Thursday. Oh, you're more than welcome, Julie. Yes, I will definitely. It will appear online when I have sorted myself out. So likely towards the back end of the week, but I will let you all know when it's online as well. Brilliant. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a really lovely evening, whatever you do. And no doubt I will catch up with you all very soon. Thank you.